Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the military recruitment center parking lot, her worn sneakers crunching against the gravel as she took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. At 28, she had already lived through more challenges than most people faced in a lifetime. But today felt different. Today, she was taking a step that would either validate everything she had endured or prove that some dreams were simply too ambitious for someone like her. The recruitment center buzzed with activity as young men and women filled out paperwork, their voices mixing with the sound of boots on linoleum floors. Sarah pushed through the glass doors, immediately noticing how the conversations seemed to pause as heads turned in her direction. She had grown accustomed to the stares over the years, though they never became easier to bear. Her appearance told a story of its own. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slender frame that seemed almost fragile, Sarah looked nothing like the typical military recruit. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were clean but clearly well worn. What most people noticed first, however, was the slight limp in her left leg, a reminder of an accident that had changed the trajectory of her life years earlier. The recruiting station was divided into different sections, each representing a branch of the military. Sarah made her way to the Navy section, where a group of young recruits had gathered around a table, chatting excitedly about their upcoming training. Their conversation was filled with bravado and nervous energy as they discussed their dreams of becoming elite warriors. "I'm going straight for the SEALs," announced Jake, a muscular young man with a buzz cut who looked like he had stepped out of a fitness magazine. "My dad was Army Special Forces, so I've got the genetics for it." The others nodded admiringly, clearly impressed by his confidence and physical presence. "Same here," chimed in Marcus, another recruit whose broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his polo shirt. "I've been training for this my whole life. CrossFit, martial arts, the works. I can do 100 push-ups without breaking a sweat." Sarah quietly took a seat at a nearby table and began filling out her initial paperwork. She tried to focus on the forms in front of her, but the conversation at the neighboring table was impossible to ignore. The young men continued to discuss their fitness routines, their athletic achievements, and their certainty that they were destined for special operations. "The instructors are going to love us," Jake continued, flexing his biceps unconsciously. "We're exactly what they're looking for. Young, strong, motivated. Not like some of the people who show up thinking they can just walk into the military." As if on cue, one of the recruits noticed Sarah sitting alone at her table. He nudged Jake and nodded in her direction. "Speaking of people who probably shouldn't be here," he whispered, though not quietly enough to avoid being overheard. Jake turned to look at Sarah, his eyes taking in her small stature and the way she favored her left leg when she had walked in. A smirk spread across his face as he turned back to his friends. "Seriously? What's she going to do? Type reports? Maybe they need someone for office work." The group erupted in quiet laughter, the sound carrying across the small space despite their attempts to be discreet. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to continue writing, her pen gripping tighter in her hand. Marcus joined in the cruel assessment. "I mean, no disrespect, but the military isn't exactly known for its inclusivity programs. There are physical standards for a reason. What happens when she can't keep up during PT? Maybe she's here for her boyfriend," suggested another recruit, causing another round of snickers. "You know, moral support while he signs up for the real military." Sarah's hand paused over the paperwork as the words hit her like physical blows. She had heard similar comments countless times throughout her life, but they never stopped stinging. People saw her limitations before they saw her potential, her weaknesses before her strengths. It was a pattern that had followed her from childhood through college and into her adult life. The recruiting office suddenly felt suffocating. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the voices too loud, the stares too numerous. Sarah considered gathering her papers and leaving, finding some excuse to walk away from what was clearly a mistake. Maybe the young men were right. Maybe she was fooling herself by even being here. But as she sat there, feeling the weight of their judgment, Sarah's mind drifted to a memory that had sustained her through countless difficult moments. She was 8 years old, sitting on the front porch of her childhood home with her father, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Dad, why do some people say mean things about how I walk?" she had asked, her young voice heavy with confusion and hurt. Her father had been quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Sarah, sweetheart, some people only see what's on the surface. They miss the most important parts of a person. But you know what I've learned in my years of service?" Sarah had shaken her head, waiting for his wisdom. The strongest warriors aren't always the ones who look the part. Sometimes they're the ones who have had to fight battles that others can't even imagine. They're the ones who know what it means to push through when everything tells them to quit. That conversation had taken place 20 years ago, but the words still resonated with crystal clarity. Sarah's father had been more than just a source of comfort during her childhood. He had been her hero, her role model, and her inspiration to push beyond what others thought possible. Lieutenant Commander David Mitchell had served with distinction in the Navy for over 2 decades. His career had taken him to some of the most challenging and dangerous places in the world, but he had always spoken about his service with a quiet pride that inspired everyone around him. Sarah had grown up hearing stories of his missions, his teammates, and the unbreakable bonds forged through shared adversity. What she hadn't learned until much later was the true extent of her father's service. David Mitchell hadn't just been a regular Navy officer. He had been a Navy SEAL, one of the elite warriors who comprised less than 1% of the entire naval force. His missions had taken him deep into enemy territory, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for his team and countless civilians. Sarah remembered the day she had discovered the truth about her father's service. She was 16, helping her mother clean out the attic when she stumbled across a box of her father's military memorabilia. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. The ring was made of gold, with intricate engravings that seemed to tell a story of honor, sacrifice, and brotherhood. On its face was the distinctive SEAL trident, the symbol that represented the pinnacle of naval special operations. Around the band were inscriptions that spoke of missions completed, lives saved, and a commitment to excellence that went far beyond ordinary military service. When Sarah had brought the ring to her mother, tears had filled the older woman's eyes. "Your father never wanted to make a big deal about what he did," she had explained. "He said that real heroes don't need recognition. They just do what needs to be done." The discovery had reframed everything Sarah thought she knew about her father. His quiet strength, his unwavering principles, his ability to remain calm under pressure. These weren't just personality traits. They were the qualities that had made him one of the most elite warriors in the world. Now, sitting in the recruitment center while young men questioned her right to be there, Sarah found strength in that memory. Her father had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. He had proven that true strength came from within, not from outward appearances. The conversation at the neighboring table had moved on to other topics, but the damage was done. Sarah could feel the occasional glance in her direction, the subtle shaking of heads that suggested these young men had already written her off as a waste of time. What they didn't know was that Sarah's journey to this recruitment center had been anything but easy. The limp they mocked was the result of a car accident during her sophomore year of college, an event that had nearly ended her dreams before they could begin. She had spent months in physical therapy, relearning how to walk, fighting through pain that would have broken many people. But the accident had also revealed something important about Sarah's character. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or accepting limitations, she had channeled her energy into other pursuits. She had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in mechanical engineering, mastering subjects that many of her male classmates found impossibly difficult. During her recovery, Sarah had also discovered an unexpected aptitude for endurance activities. Unable to participate in high-impact sports, she had turned to swimming, cycling, and other low-impact exercises that didn't stress her injured leg. To her surprise, she found that her body responded well to the challenge, and her mental toughness, forged through years of overcoming obstacles, gave her an edge that pure athletic ability couldn't match. She had completed 3 marathons, despite her physical limitations. She had learned to rock climb, pushing through fear and doubt to reach summits that seemed impossible from the ground. Most importantly, she had developed an unshakable belief in her own capabilities, even when others doubted her. As Sarah continued filling out her paperwork, she became aware that the recruiting sergeant had been watching the interaction between her and the other recruits. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was a veteran with over 15 years of service, and his weathered face suggested he had seen his share of both heroes and wannabes. Rodriguez approached Sarah's table, his expression neutral, but his eyes kind. "How are you doing with those forms, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about the people under his watch. "Fine, thank you," Sarah replied, looking up to meet his gaze. There was something in his manner that suggested he understood more about her situation than the other recruits in the room. First time considering military service? Rodriguez asked, pulling up a chair across from her. Yes, sir. Well, not exactly. I've been thinking about it for years, but I wanted to finish my degree first. Sarah's voice was steady, showing none of the uncertainty she felt inside. What's your educational background? Rodriguez inquired, genuinely interested in her answer. Mechanical engineering from State University. I graduated last spring. Sarah watched as surprise flickered across the sergeant's face. It was clear that he hadn't expected that answer. Engineering, huh? That's impressive. The Navy has a lot of opportunities for someone with your background. What draws you to military service? Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to reveal. My father served. He always said that some things are bigger than ourselves, that we have a responsibility to protect what matters. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Your father sounds like a wise man. What branch did he serve in? Navy. He was. Sarah paused, still not comfortable with revealing the full truth. He was an officer. Served for over 20 years. A career man. I respect that. What was his specialty? Before Sarah could answer, Jake's voice carried across the room again. Sergeant, when do we get to take the physical fitness test? I'm ready to show you what real military material looks like. Rodriguez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his years of service, he had learned to distinguish between genuine confidence and empty bravado. Jake's comment fell squarely into the latter category. Physical fitness is certainly important, Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying across the room so that everyone could hear. But it's not the only measure of a good sailor. Some of the best military personnel I've served with weren't the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who never quit, who put their teammates first, and who could think clearly under pressure. Jake's expression suggested he wasn't particularly interested in the sergeant's perspective on teamwork and mental toughness. Sure, but let's be realistic. Special operations requires a certain level of physical capability. Not everyone is cut out for it. Rodriguez turned back to Sarah, lowering his voice so their conversation became more private. What kind of role are you interested in pursuing? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would likely invite more skepticism. I'd like to be considered for special operations. I know it's competitive, but I believe I have the qualities necessary to succeed. For the first time since entering the recruitment center, Sarah saw something other than doubt in another person's eyes. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. Special operations is indeed competitive. It requires physical capability, mental toughness, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. What makes you think you have what it takes? Sarah's mind raced as she considered how to answer. She could talk about her academic achievements, her endurance activities, or her determination to overcome obstacles. But something in Rodriguez's manner suggested he was looking for something deeper. Because I've already been tested, she said finally. Maybe not in the way that these gentlemen have been tested, but I've learned what it means to push through when everything tells you to quit. I've learned that the only limitations that matter are the ones you accept for yourself. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. In his experience, the recruits who spoke with quiet conviction rather than loud bravado were often the ones who surprised everyone. You know, he said finally, some of the most successful special operations personnel I've known were underestimated by others. They had to prove themselves every day, which made them tougher and more determined than people who had everything handed to them. As if sensing that he was no longer the center of attention, Jake raised his voice again. Sergeant, I don't mean to interrupt, but shouldn't we focus on recruits who actually have a chance of making it through training? I mean, no offense, but some people are just setting themselves up for failure. The room fell silent. Sarah felt every eye in the place turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to the obvious challenge. Her heart pounded as she realized this was a defining moment. She could shrink away from the confrontation, accepting the role of victim that these young men had assigned to her. Or she could stand up for herself and everything she believed in. Rodriguez's expression had hardened considerably. Son, in my experience, the people who spend the most time talking about who doesn't belong are usually the ones who end up washing out themselves. But Sarah barely heard the sergeant's defense. Something had shifted inside her, a recognition that this moment required more than words. These young men had made assumptions about her based on her appearance, just as countless others had done throughout her life. They saw weakness where she knew there was strength, limitation where she had found possibility. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was her father's seal ring, the symbol of achievement that represented everything she aspired to become. She had carried it with her for luck, never intending to reveal it unless absolutely necessary. But, as she looked around the room at the faces filled with skepticism and barely concealed mockery, Sarah realized that this was exactly the moment her father would have wanted her to stand up for herself. Not with anger or defensiveness, but with quiet dignity and unshakable confidence. The young men at the neighboring table had no idea what was about to happen. They continued their conversation, occasionally glancing in Sarah's direction with amused expressions. To them, she was nothing more than a source of entertainment, a reminder of their own superiority. Sarah stood up slowly, her movement causing a hush to fall over the immediate area. She walked over to Jake's table, her slight limp more pronounced due to her nervousness, but her posture straight and confident. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about special operations and who belongs in the military." Jake looked up at her with a condescending smile. "Oh, hey there. Look, I didn't mean anything personal. It's just that special ops is really demanding, and not everyone is physically capable of meeting the standards." "You're absolutely right," Sarah replied, surprising him with her agreement. "Special operations does require exceptional physical and mental capabilities. It's not for everyone." Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying what he assumed was Sarah's concession to their superior qualifications. "Exactly. I mean, I'm sure you could find a good role somewhere in the military. Maybe something in administration or logistics." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Those are important roles. But I was actually thinking about something a bit more challenging." She paused, letting the anticipation build for a moment. "You see, I've heard a lot about what it takes to be a SEAL. The training, the missions, the brotherhood." Jake laughed, the sound carrying a note of disbelief. "Brotherhood is right. It's an exclusive club for people who can handle extreme physical and mental challenges. Not exactly something you can just decide to join." "No," Sarah agreed. "It's not something you can just decide to join. It's something you have to earn through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Something that becomes part of who you are forever." She reached into her pocket and slowly withdrew the velvet pouch. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as she carefully opened it and removed her father's ring. The sealed trident caught the fluorescent light as Sarah held the ring up for everyone to see. The symbol was unmistakable, its significance immediately clear to anyone with even basic military knowledge. "This belonged to my father," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Lieutenant Commander David Mitchell, United States Navy SEALs. 23 years of service, including tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified missions that I'm still not allowed to know about." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Jake's mouth fell open as he stared at the ring, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Marcus looked like he had been slapped, his face flushing red with embarrassment. Rodriguez stood up from his table, moving closer to get a better look at the ring. His expression had shifted from professional interest to genuine respect as he recognized the authenticity of what Sarah held. "He never told me war stories," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He said that real warriors don't need to brag about their service. They just do what needs to be done, quietly and professionally, because that's what the mission requires." She looked directly at Jake, her eyes steady and unflinching. "He also taught me that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's physical power. Sometimes it's the ability to keep going when everyone tells you to quit. And sometimes it's having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when you're outnumbered." The young men at the table looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by shame and recognition of their own presumption. Sarah carefully placed the ring back in its pouch, her movements deliberate and respectful. "I'm not here because I think military service will be easy. I'm here because I understand what sacrifice means. Because I know that the greatest honor isn't in talking about what you're going to do, it's in actually doing it." She turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying to every corner of the recruitment center. "My father died 3 years ago from cancer he developed during his service overseas. His last words to me were that the greatest tribute I could give him wouldn't be tears or monuments. It would be living a life worthy of the sacrifices he and his teammates made for our freedom." The emotional weight of her revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Even the most cynical observers found themselves moved by the quiet dignity with which Sarah shared her story. Rodriguez stepped forward, his own voice thick with emotion. "Miss Mitchell, it would be an honor to help you begin your journey in military service. If you're half the sailor your father was, the Navy will be lucky to have you. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I shouldn't have said those things. Sarah looked at him for a long moment before responding. You're right. You didn't know. But that's exactly the point. You made assumptions about me based on what you could see, without taking the time to learn who I actually am. That's a dangerous habit for someone who wants to be part of a team where lives depend on trust and understanding. The lesson hung in the air, clear and undeniable. Sarah had not only defended herself, but had provided a masterclass in leadership and grace under pressure. As the morning progressed, word of the incident spread throughout the recruitment center. Sarah found herself at the center of respectful attention rather than mockery, with staff members and other recruits approaching to express their admiration for both her and her father's service. But, for Sarah, the most important moment came when Rodriguez pulled her aside for a private conversation. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that what happened here today tells me everything I need to know about your character. Your father would be proud of how you handled that situation. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time that day. Thank you, Sergeant. That means more to me than you know. I also want you to know that the Navy has several programs specifically designed to identify and develop exceptional candidates for special operations. Based on what I've seen today, I think you should be considered for accelerated evaluation. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. After years of being told what she couldn't do, here was a military professional suggesting that she might not only be capable of achieving her dreams, but might be able to do so faster than the traditional timeline. What would that involve? She asked, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. Preliminary fitness assessments, psychological evaluations, and interviews with special operations personnel. It's designed to identify candidates who might not fit the traditional mold, but who possess the intangible qualities that make great operators. Sarah nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. When could I start? Rodriguez smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. How about we begin the paperwork right now? As Sarah returned to her table to complete her enlistment documents, she caught Jake watching her with an expression of newfound respect. When their eyes met, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke volumes about how much the morning's events had changed his perspective. The recruitment center that had felt so hostile just hours earlier now seemed full of possibility. Sarah had not only defended her right to be there, but had opened doors that might have remained closed for months or years under normal circumstances. But, as she filled out form after form, Sarah couldn't help but think about the long journey that lay ahead. The ring in her pocket was a reminder of what was possible, but it was also a symbol of the immense challenges she would face. Special operations training was designed to break down candidates and rebuild them into something stronger. It would test every limit she thought she had, and then demand that she go further. Physical pain, mental exhaustion, and emotional stress would be constant companions. Yet for the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly ready for the challenge. Not because she was the strongest or the fastest, but because she understood something that many of her male counterparts had yet to learn. True strength wasn't about proving yourself to others. It was about refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose on you. The morning sun streamed through the recruitment center windows as Sarah signed her name to the final document. In doing so, she was not just enlisting in the Navy. She was beginning a journey that would test everything she believed about herself and potentially lead her to follow in her father's footsteps as one of the elite few who earned the right to wear the SEAL trident. The recruits who had laughed at her that morning had no idea they had just witnessed the first chapter of what might become an extraordinary military career. Sarah Mitchell was no longer just a young woman with a limp and a dream. She was a future sailor with the blood of a warrior flowing in her veins and the determination to prove that heroes come in all sizes. The naval training station at Great Lakes buzzed with constant activity as thousands of new recruits began their transformation from civilians to sailors. Sarah Mitchell stepped off the bus with her fellow recruits, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her father's ring carefully secured in a pocket close to her heart. The weeks since her confrontation at the recruitment center had passed in a blur of medical examinations, paperwork, and final preparations for what would be the most challenging period of her life. Boot camp was designed to be a crucible that tested every aspect of a recruit's character. The drill instructors were legendary for their ability to identify weakness and exploit it until candidates either broke or found reserves of strength they never knew existed. For Sarah, who had already endured years of skepticism about her capabilities, the psychological challenges would be familiar territory. The physical demands, however, represented uncharted waters. Petty Officer First Class Angela Torres was waiting when Sarah's group assembled for their first formation. Torres was a compact woman with steel-gray eyes and a voice that could carry across a parade ground without amplification. Her reputation preceded her, as did the whispered stories about recruits who had tried to challenge her authority and found themselves on the wrong end of creative punishment details. "Welcome to the United States Navy," Torres announced, her gaze sweeping across the assembled recruits with the precision of a searchlight. "For the next 8 weeks, your civilian life no longer exists. Your comfort, your preferences, your excuses, all irrelevant. You are here to discover whether you have what it takes to defend this nation." Sarah found herself standing next to a recruit named Kevin Walsh, a farm boy from Iowa whose hands were already calloused from years of manual labor. On her other side was Maria Santos, a former college athlete who had given up a scholarship to pursue military service. The diversity of backgrounds represented in their training company was remarkable, yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she remained the outsider. The first week of training was a systematic destruction of everything the recruits thought they knew about themselves. Dawn came at 0500 hours with a jarring sound of reveille, followed immediately by physical training that left even the most athletic candidates gasping for air. Sarah's engineering background had prepared her for logical problem-solving, but nothing had prepared her for the relentless pace of military indoctrination. During their first PT session, the company was divided into groups based on initial fitness assessments. Sarah found herself placed in what the instructors diplomatically called the developmental group, a designation that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. As they began their first run around the training facility, she could feel the eyes of other recruits tracking her movement, waiting to see if the woman with the slight limp would become a liability to the group. The route was 2 miles through the base, with several hills that tested the cardiovascular fitness of even the strongest athletes. Sarah started conservatively, knowing that her leg would begin to ache if she pushed too hard too early. Behind her, she could hear the labored breathing of recruits who had overestimated their conditioning, while ahead of her, the natural athletes maintained conversation as if the run was nothing more than a warm-up. Halfway through the course, Sarah's left leg began to protest. The familiar burning sensation started in her hip and radiated down to her ankle, a reminder of the hardware that had been installed to repair the damage from her accident. She gritted her teeth and focused on her breathing, employing techniques she had learned during her marathon training. "Mitchell," Torres's voice cut through the morning air as the instructor appeared beside her on a bicycle. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, Petty Officer," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed the effort she was expending. Torres studied her for a moment, noting the slight hitch in her gait, but also the determination in her eyes. "You know, Mitchell, the easiest thing for me to do would be to pull you out of this run and put you on light duty. Would you like that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah understood that her answer would define how she was perceived for the remainder of training. Accept the easy path, and she would forever be seen as someone who needed special accommodation. Push through the discomfort, and she might earn the respect she desperately sought. "No, Petty Officer. I can finish the run." Torres nodded slowly. "I believe you can. But the question isn't whether you can finish. The question is whether you can finish and still be ready to help your shipmates when they need it." The instructor pedaled ahead, leaving Sarah to contemplate the deeper meaning of her words. Military service wasn't about individual achievement. It was about collective strength, about being part of something larger than oneself. As they approached the final hill, Sarah noticed that Kevin Walsh was struggling badly. The farm boy who had seemed so strong during initial introductions was now pale and sweating profusely, his breathing ragged and uncontrolled. Other recruits were passing him, focused on their own performance and unwilling to sacrifice their times to help a struggling teammate. Without hesitation, Sarah moved alongside Kevin. "Come on, partner. We're almost there. Just stay with me." Kevin looked at her with surprise and gratitude. I can't. My chest feels like it's going to explode." "Then, we'll walk," Sarah said simply. "But we'll finish together." For the remainder of the hill, Sarah matched Kevin's pace, offering encouragement and distraction through conversation. When they reached the top, Kevin had recovered enough to jog the final quarter mile to the finish line. They crossed together, well behind the leaders, but ahead of several recruits who had fallen out of the run entirely. Torres was waiting at the finish line, her expression unreadable as she watched the final stragglers complete the course. When Sarah and Kevin approached, she made a note on her clipboard but said nothing. That evening, as the recruits cleaned their barracks and prepared for the next day's challenges, Sarah found herself approached by several of her fellow trainees. Word had spread about her decision to help Kevin, and the reaction was mixed. "That was really cool what you did today," Maria Santos said as she folded her uniforms with military precision. Kevin was in real trouble out there. But not everyone was impressed. Jake Morrison, who had arrived at Great Lakes after enlisting at a different recruitment center, shook his head in disapproval. "You realize that in the real Navy, slowing down for weak links can get people killed, right? Sometimes you have to leave people behind." Sarah looked at him steadily. "And sometimes helping people find their strength makes the whole team stronger. I guess we'll find out which philosophy works better." The philosophical divide became more apparent as training progressed. The weeks blurred together in a relentless cycle of physical training, classroom instruction, and military customs. Sarah's academic background served her well during written examinations and technical training, where her engineering education provided advantages that pure athleticism couldn't match. During seamanship classes, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems and problem-solving that impressed even the most experienced instructors. When other recruits struggled with complex technical concepts, Sarah found herself naturally falling into a teaching role, explaining difficult material in ways that made it accessible to her classmates. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, one of the senior instructors, began to take notice of Sarah's leadership qualities. Unlike the bombastic style favored by some recruits, Sarah led through competence and quiet confidence. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention, and she never claimed credit for group achievements. "Mitchell," Rodriguez called after a particularly challenging navigation exercise where Sarah's team had outperformed all others. "A word." Sarah reported to the chief's office, uncertain whether she was in trouble or being recognized for her performance. Rodriguez gestured for her to sit, an unusual informality that suggested this was more than a routine counseling session. "I've been reviewing your file," Rodriguez began, opening a folder that contained Sarah's complete military record. "Your father was David Mitchell." It wasn't a question, and Sarah felt her breath catch. Her father's legacy had followed her to Great Lakes, though she had hoped to establish herself on her own merits before that connection was made. "Yes, Chief." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "I served with your father in Afghanistan in 2010. He saved my life during a mission that went sideways. Never talked about it, never asked for recognition. Just did what needed to be done." Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with the ache of loss that always accompanied discussions of her father's service. "That sounds like him. What it tells me," Rodriguez continued, "is that you come from good stock. But, more importantly, it tells me that you understand what service really means. Your father never talked about being a hero. He talked about taking care of his teammates and completing the mission." The chief pulled out another set of papers from Sarah's file. "Your scores are impressive. Academic performance in the top 5%, leadership evaluations that consistently mention your ability to bring out the best in others, and physical fitness improvements that show you're not afraid of hard work." Sarah waited, sensing that Rodriguez was building towards something important. "There's a program I want to discuss with you. It's called the Naval Special Operations Preparatory Course. It's designed to identify and develop candidates who might not fit the traditional special operations mold, but who possess the character traits that make exceptional operators." Sarah's heart began to race. This was the opportunity she had dreamed about since enlisting, the chance to follow in her father's footsteps and earn the right to wear the SEAL Trident. The course is voluntary and extremely demanding. The physical standards are higher than anything you've experienced here, and the psychological pressure is designed to break down candidates who aren't completely committed. Many people who enter the program don't complete it. "What would I need to do?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. Rodriguez smiled, recognizing the hunger for challenge that he had seen in the best special operations candidates. "First, you'd need to complete boot camp in the top 10% of your class. Based on your current performance, that's achievable. Then, you'd report to the Special Operations Preparatory Course at Naval Station Norfolk for 12 weeks of intensive training." The opportunity was everything Sarah had hoped for, but she knew better than to make an immediate decision. The lessons learned from her father had taught her to think strategically about major choices. "Chief, can I ask you something about my father's service?" "Of course. What made him successful?" "I mean, beyond the obvious things like physical fitness and technical skills. What made him special? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his mind traveling back to the missions he had shared with David Mitchell. Your father understood that being a SEAL isn't about being the toughest guy in the room. It's about being someone that others can count on absolutely. When everything goes wrong, and it will go wrong, you need people who won't quit, who will find a way to complete the mission and bring everyone home. He looked at Sarah directly, his expression serious. Your father also understood that real strength sometimes looks different than people expect. The team needs people who can think under pressure, who can adapt when plans fall apart, and who can inspire others to push beyond what they thought possible. Sarah absorbed the words, understanding that Rodriguez was telling her something important about her own potential. Her physical limitations might always set her apart from the traditional image of a special operations warrior, but they had also forced her to develop mental and emotional strengths that could be even more valuable. Chief, I'd like to volunteer for the preparatory course. Rodriguez nodded, having expected that response. I'll start the paperwork. But, Mitchell, I want you to understand something. The fact that your father was a SEAL won't help you if you can't meet the standards. If anything, it will create higher expectations. You'll need to prove yourself on your own merits. I wouldn't want it any other way. The remaining weeks of boot camp took on new significance as Sarah prepared for the challenges ahead. Her physical training became more focused and intense, with additional sessions designed to build the specific types of strength and endurance required for special operations training. Kevin Walsh, the farm boy she had helped during their first run, had become one of her closest friends in the company. His initial struggles with cardiovascular fitness had given way to steady improvement, and he often sought Sarah's advice on training techniques and mental preparation. I still can't believe you're going for SEAL training, Kevin said one evening as they cleaned their gear after a particularly demanding day of field exercises. I mean, I think it's amazing, but aren't you nervous about being the only woman in the program? Sarah had been thinking about that reality since accepting Rodriguez's invitation. The Naval Special Operations community remained predominantly male, and she would likely face skepticism similar to what she had encountered at the recruitment center. Nervous? Absolutely. But not because I'm a woman. I'm nervous because the standards are incredibly high, and I'm not sure I can meet them. My gender is just one more challenge to overcome. Maria Santos, who had been listening to their conversation, joined in. You know what I think? I think you're going to surprise a lot of people. You've already surprised everyone here. It was true that Sarah's reputation within the training company had evolved dramatically since those first difficult days. The recruit who had been written off by some as a liability had become someone that others sought out for advice and support. Her combination of technical expertise, leadership ability, and quiet determination had earned respect from both peers and instructors. The final week of boot camp included a series of practical exercises designed to test everything the recruits had learned. Sarah's company was tasked with a complex scenario that required navigation, communication, and teamwork under simulated combat conditions. As the exercise began, Sarah found herself naturally falling into a leadership role despite not being officially designated as the team leader. When communication equipment failed, she quickly diagnosed the technical problem and implemented a solution. When the team became lost due to poor navigation, she used her engineering background to help them re-establish their position. Most importantly, when several team members became demoralized by the seemingly impossible nature of their assigned mission, Sarah provided the encouragement and strategic thinking that got them back on track. The exercise concluded with the successful completion of all objectives, and Sarah's team was recognized as the best performing group in the company. During the debrief, Torres made a point of highlighting the leadership qualities that had made the difference. Mitchell demonstrated something important during this exercise, Torres announced to the assembled recruits. Real leadership isn't about giving orders or being the loudest person in the room. It's about making everyone around you better and finding ways to turn problems into solutions. The recognition felt good, but Sarah knew that it was just preparation for the much greater challenges ahead. The Naval Special Operations Preparatory Course would test her in ways that boot camp never could. On graduation day, Sarah stood with her fellow recruits as they officially became United States sailors. The ceremony was attended by families and friends, though Sarah's only visitor was her mother, who had traveled from their hometown to witness this milestone. Your father would be so proud, her mother whispered as they embraced after the ceremony. Not just because of what you've accomplished, but because of how you've accomplished it. You've honored his memory by staying true to your values. As Sarah prepared to leave Great Lakes for her next assignment, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day at the recruitment center. The young woman who had been mocked for her audacity in pursuing military service had become a sailor with legitimate opportunities for special operations training. But she also understood that the real test was just beginning. The preparatory course would separate those who dreamed about being elite warriors from those who had the character to actually become them. Physical pain, mental exhaustion, and emotional stress would be constant companions. Sarah's father's ring remained in her possession, a tangible reminder of what was possible for those willing to pay the price. But she no longer needed external validation of her worth. The weeks at Great Lakes had taught her that she possessed the most important qualification for special operations service, an unshakable belief in her own ability to overcome any challenge. The bus that would take her to Norfolk was scheduled to depart early the next morning. As Sarah packed her gear one final time, she found herself thinking not about the obstacles ahead, but about the opportunities. She was no longer just David Mitchell's daughter or the recruit who had surprised everyone with her determination. She was Seaman Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy, and she was ready to discover exactly what she was capable of achieving. The journey that had begun with laughter and skepticism at a recruitment center was about to enter its most demanding phase. But, for the first time in her life, Sarah felt completely prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation from civilian to sailor was complete. Now came the real test of whether she could complete the transformation from sailor to something even more extraordinary. Torres found Sarah as she prepared to leave for her final liberty before reporting to Norfolk. The drill instructor who had pushed her harder than anyone else during training looked almost proud as she offered her hand. "Mitchell, I've trained thousands of recruits over the years. Most of them never surprise me. They're exactly what they appear to be on day one. But every once in a while, someone comes along who reminds me why this job matters. You've been that person for this company. Thank you, petty officer. You helped me discover strengths I didn't know I had." Torres smiled, a rare expression that transformed her usually stern features. "That strength was always there. We just gave you permission to use it. Don't forget that when things get difficult in Norfolk, the person who finishes this course isn't going to be fundamentally different from the person who starts it. She's just going to be more honest about who she's always been." As Sarah walked away from the Great Lakes training facility for the final time, she carried with her more than just her father's ring and her own determination. She carried the respect of her instructors, the friendship of her fellow sailors, and, most importantly, an unshakable confidence in her ability to succeed at whatever challenge came next. The road to Norfolk stretched ahead, both literally and figuratively. In just a few days, Sarah would begin the most demanding training of her life, surrounded by candidates who had been preparing for this opportunity their entire adult lives. But she was no longer the uncertain young woman who had walked into that recruitment center months earlier. She was a United States sailor who had proven herself under pressure, who had demonstrated leadership in difficult circumstances, and who understood that true strength came from lifting up others rather than tearing them down. The recruits who had laughed at her seemed like figures from a distant past. Their skepticism had been replaced by the respect of professional military instructors and the friendship of sailors who had seen her character tested under pressure. Sarah Mitchell was ready for whatever came next. Naval Station Norfolk represented the pinnacle of naval special operations training, where the most elite warriors in the world honed their skills and where countless dreams had been shattered against the unforgiving reality of what it truly meant to serve among the best. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the base on a humid Virginia morning, her sea bag containing everything she owned, and her mind focused on the challenge that would define the next 12 weeks of her life. The Naval Special Operations Preparatory Course was unlike anything she had experienced during boot camp. Where Great Lakes had been about learning the fundamentals of military service, Norfolk was about discovering whether she possessed the rare combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and character that separated special operations personnel from the rest of the military. The compound where the preparatory course was conducted existed within the larger naval station, but operated under its own rules and standards. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded the training facility, and armed guards checked identification at multiple checkpoints. The message was clear. What happened here was serious business, conducted by serious professionals. Sarah reported to the administration building at 0600 hours, joining a group of 24 other candidates who had been selected from across the Navy's recruiting regions. Her first impression of her fellow trainees was humbling. These were not the typical recruits she had encountered at Great Lakes. Every person in the room looked like they had stepped out of a fitness magazine, their physiques sculpted by years of dedicated training. Michael Torres, a former college wrestler from Texas, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with shoulders that seemed to span half the room. His conversation revealed that he had been preparing for special operations training since high school, following a regimen designed by a former SEAL who served as his mentor. David Chun had been a competitive swimmer at the Naval Academy before volunteering for special operations. His endurance capabilities were legendary among his peers, and his academic credentials rivaled those of any officer in the Navy. Rachel Harper was the only other woman in the group, a former Marine who had transferred to the Navy specifically to pursue SEAL training after the combat exclusion policies were modified. Her reputation as a warrior had preceded her arrival, with stories of her performance in Afghanistan earning respect from even the most skeptical observers. As Sarah listened to her fellow candidates discuss their backgrounds and qualifications, she felt the familiar sensation of being the outsider. These were professional athletes and combat veterans, people who had been preparing for this moment their entire adult lives. Her own journey seemed almost accidental by comparison. Commander James Sullivan entered the room at precisely 0630, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. Sullivan was a legend in the special operations community, with over 20 years of service that included deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades. His weathered face and calm demeanor suggested someone who had seen everything and been tested by the worst that warfare could offer. "Welcome to the Naval Special Operations Preparatory Course," Sullivan began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "You are here because someone believed you might possess the qualities necessary to serve among the elite. Over the next 12 weeks, we will discover whether that belief was justified." Sullivan's gaze swept across the assembled candidates, taking the measure of each person with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated thousands of potential warriors over the years. "Let me be clear about something from the beginning. Physical fitness is the minimum requirement for what we do. Every person in this room can run fast, swim far, and lift heavy weights. Those capabilities will be tested, but they are not what determines success or failure in this program." Sarah felt some of her anxiety ease as Sullivan continued his introduction. Her physical limitations had been her greatest concern, but his emphasis on character over pure athleticism suggested that other qualities might be equally important. "What we are looking for," Sullivan continued, "are people who can think clearly under extreme stress, who can adapt when plans fall apart, and who will never abandon their teammates regardless of the personal cost. These qualities cannot be measured by a stopwatch or a scale. They can only be observed under pressure." The first week of the preparatory course was designed to establish baselines for each candidate's physical and mental capabilities. Sarah found herself struggling during some of the pure strength assessments, her smaller frame placing her at a disadvantage compared to candidates like Torres who had been lifting weights seriously for over a decade. The running evaluations revealed similar disparities, where Sarah had to work hard to maintain a 7-minute per mile pace during long-distance runs. Candidates like Chun could sustain sub-6-minute miles for distances that left others gasping for air. But the water was a different story entirely. Sarah's years of swimming during her rehabilitation had given her an efficiency in the water that surprised even her instructors. During the initial swim assessment, a 2-mile open water course in the Chesapeake Bay, Sarah finished in the top 3 despite being one of the smallest candidates in the group. More importantly, her performance during team-based exercises began to demonstrate the leadership qualities that had impressed her instructors at Great Lakes. When her team was assigned a complex navigation exercise that required both technical problem-solving and group coordination, Sarah's engineering background and natural teaching ability made the difference between success and failure. Instructor Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams was a former SEAL who had transitioned to training duties after sustaining injuries during a deployment to Syria. His evaluation methods were unorthodox, but revealing, focusing more on how candidates responded to failure than how they handled success. "Mitchell," Williams called after observing Sarah during a particularly challenging rope climbing exercise where her lack of upper body strength had been painfully evident. "What did you learn from that experience?" Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead as she considered the question. Her time on the rope course had been significantly slower than most of her fellow candidates, and she had failed to complete one of the more difficult obstacles entirely. "I learned that I need to find different approaches to the same problems, Chief. My technique isn't going to be the same as Torres or Chun, so I need to be smarter about how I use the strength I do have." Williams nodded approvingly. And what else? Sarah thought for a moment, recognizing that there was a deeper lesson embedded in the exercise. I learned that individual performance is only part of the equation. Even if I'm the slowest person on the obstacle course, I can still contribute to the team's success by helping others improve their techniques or by taking on different roles that play to my strengths. Exactly, Williams replied. Special operations is not about individual heroes. It's about teams that function so effectively that the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Remember that. As the weeks progressed, the intensity of training increased exponentially. Sleep deprivation became a constant factor as candidates were awakened at random hours for emergency drills and extended exercises. Food was rationed to levels that left everyone constantly hungry, and the mental stress of never knowing what challenge would come next began to take its toll on even the strongest personalities. Sarah's slight frame, which had been a disadvantage during strength-based assessments, became an asset during the long endurance challenges that characterized the middle phase of training. Her body required fewer calories to maintain function, and her experience with pushing through pain during her rehabilitation gave her mental tools that others lacked. During the infamous Hell Week portion of the course, candidates were subjected to 5 days of continuous training with virtually no sleep and minimal nutrition. The exercise was designed to strip away all pretenses and reveal the core character of each individual. By the third day, several candidates had voluntarily withdrawn from the program. The combination of physical exhaustion and mental stress had proven too much for people who had seemed invincible during the early weeks of training. Torres, the powerful wrestler who had seemed like a sure bet for success, rang the bell that signified his decision to quit after suffering what appeared to be a minor ankle injury. "It's not worth it," he explained to Sarah as he prepared to leave the compound. "I can get just as good training and career opportunities in other parts of the Navy without putting myself through this kind of punishment." Sarah understood his reasoning, but couldn't relate to it. The punishment wasn't something to be endured in pursuit of career advancement. It was a necessary part of discovering whether she possessed the qualities that had made her father capable of extraordinary service. During the fourth night of Hell Week, Sarah's team was assigned a mission that required them to cross 5 miles of swampland while carrying a wounded teammate on an improvised stretcher. The wounded person was actually a training dummy weighted to simulate a real casualty, but the physical and mental challenges were entirely authentic. 2 hours into the mission, Chen began showing signs of heat exhaustion. The former swimmer who had seemed invincible during water-based exercises was struggling with the combination of humid Virginia weather, physical exhaustion, and the weight of the stretcher. Without discussion, Sarah moved to take his place at the front of the stretcher, despite being significantly smaller than any of the other team members. The additional weight immediately stressed her already fatigued muscles, but she adjusted her pace and breathing to accommodate the new demands. "Mitchell, you don't have to do this," gasped Rachel Harper, who was struggling with her own fatigue. "Chen will recover in a few minutes." "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the obvious effort she was expending. "But we don't leave people behind, and we don't wait for convenient moments to help each other." The team completed the mission 45 minutes ahead of schedule, with Sarah maintaining her position at the front of the stretcher for the entire remaining distance. When they finally reached the extraction point, she collapsed alongside her teammates, her body pushed beyond what she had thought possible. Williams was waiting at the extraction point, his expression unreadable as he observed the candidate's condition. His evaluation notes from that night would later become part of Sarah's permanent record. Mitchell demonstrates exceptional leadership under stress and an instinctive understanding of team dynamics. Physical limitations are compensated by mental toughness and tactical intelligence. Hell Week concluded with an individual survival exercise that required each candidate to evade capture by a team of instructors for 36 hours while navigating to a series of checkpoints scattered across 100 square miles of Virginia wilderness. Candidates were given minimal equipment and were expected to find food, water, and shelter using only their training and ingenuity. Sarah's engineering background proved invaluable during this phase of training. Where other candidates relied on brute force or pure athletic ability, she approached problems systematically, using her technical knowledge to construct more efficient shelters and navigation aids. On the second day of the exercise, she encountered Harper, who had become disoriented after losing her compass during a river crossing. The Marine was clearly frustrated and beginning to show signs of panic as darkness approached without her reaching any of the required checkpoints. Despite the competitive nature of the exercise, Sarah shared her navigation information with Harper and helped her construct a shelter for the night. The assistance cost Sarah valuable time in her own progression through the course, but she never hesitated in offering help. "Why would you do that?" Harper asked as they huddled together for warmth during the cold Virginia night. "You know they're grading us individually on this exercise." Sarah considered the question, thinking about everything her father had taught her about military service. "Because real missions aren't individual exercises. They're about bringing everyone home safely. If I can't demonstrate that commitment during training, how can I be trusted to do it when lives actually depend on it?" Both women completed the survival exercise successfully, though Sarah's final time was significantly impacted by her decision to help Harper. When she reported to the final checkpoint, Williams was waiting with what might have been a small smile. "Mitchell, your time was among the slowest in the class. Any explanation?" "No excuse, Chief. I made choices that slowed my progress, but I'd make the same choices again under similar circumstances." Williams made another note in his evaluation folder. Later, Sarah would learn that her performance during the survival exercise had been one of the deciding factors in her advancement to the next phase of training. The final weeks of the preparatory course focused on advanced tactical training and team exercises that simulated the types of missions that SEAL teams actually conducted. Sarah's academic background became increasingly valuable as the scenarios became more complex and technical. During a simulated hostage rescue mission, her team was required to breach a fortified building while minimizing risk to the hostages inside. While other teams relied on overwhelming force or elaborate tactical maneuvers, Sarah's team used her engineering knowledge to identify structural weaknesses that allowed them to create entry points that the enemy hadn't anticipated. The mission was completed with perfect scores in all evaluation categories, and Sarah's innovative approach was highlighted during the after-action review as an example of how technical expertise could multiply the effectiveness of tactical skills. Commander Sullivan personally delivered the evaluation that would determine Sarah's future in special operations. She reported to his office during the final week of training, uncertain whether her performance had been sufficient to earn advancement to the next level. "Seaman Mitchell," Sullivan began, opening a thick folder that contained her complete training record. "Your performance during this course has been interesting and, in many ways, exceptional." Sarah waited, knowing that Sullivan's reputation for directness meant she would receive honest feedback regardless of whether it was what she wanted to hear. "Your physical performance has been adequate, but not outstanding. There are areas where your smaller frame places you at a disadvantage compared to other candidates. However, your mental performance and leadership capabilities have been consistently superior." Sullivan turned to a specific page in her file. "More importantly, your understanding of what Special Operations Service actually requires has been evident throughout training. You've demonstrated repeatedly that you understand the difference between individual achievement and team success." "Thank you, sir." Sullivan closed the folder and looked at Sarah directly. "I'm recommending you for advancement to basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. BUD/S is significantly more demanding than anything you've experienced here, and the failure rate is approximately 75%. Do you believe you're ready for that challenge?" Sarah felt her heart racing as the magnitude of the opportunity settled over her. This was the moment she had dreamed about since childhood, the chance to follow in her father's footsteps and earn the right to wear the SEAL trident. "Sir, I believe I have the character and commitment necessary to succeed. I understand that I'll need to continue improving my physical capabilities, but I'm confident that my mental preparation and leadership skills will compensate for any physical limitations." Sullivan nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud of how you've conducted yourself during this course. But remember, BUD/S doesn't care about your heritage or your motivations. It only cares about whether you can meet the standards and contribute to team success." "I understand, sir. I'm ready." As Sarah left Sullivan's office with orders to report to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado for BUD/S training, she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that was unlike anything she had experienced before. The preparatory course had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that would shape her approach to the even greater challenges ahead. The 12 weeks at Norfolk had transformed her from a sailor with potential into a proven candidate for the most elite military training in the world. She had earned the respect of instructors who had seen thousands of aspiring warriors, and She had demonstrated leadership capabilities that set her apart from even the most physically gifted candidates. But she also understood that BUD/S would be a completely different level of challenge. The preparatory course had been designed to identify candidates with the right characteristics for special operations training. BUD/S was designed to forge those candidates into actual Navy SEALs through a process that had broken countless strong and capable people. As Sarah packed her gear for the cross-country journey to California, she thought about the candidates who had started the preparatory course with her 12 weeks earlier. Of the 24 people who had begun training, only 8 had successfully completed the program. Physical injuries, mental stress, and simple recognition that special operations wasn't for them had eliminated the majority of candidates who had seemed so impressive during those first days. Torres, the wrestler who had quit during Hell Week, had been assigned to a surface warfare unit where his leadership skills and physical capabilities would serve him well in a more traditional military role. Chun, despite his exceptional swimming abilities, had been eliminated after failing to adapt his individual excellence to team-based scenarios. Even Harper, the experienced Marine, had struggled with the transition from the individual focus of her previous service to the team-oriented approach required for special operations success. Sarah's success during the preparatory course had not been based on superior physical abilities or previous military experience. Instead, it had emerged from her understanding that military service was about something larger than individual achievement. Her father's lessons about sacrifice, teamwork, and quiet professionalism had provided a foundation that proved stronger than any amount of physical training. The night before her departure for California, Sarah called her mother to share the news of her advancement to BUD/S training. "I'm so proud of you," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father always said that the most important battles are fought inside our own minds, against our own doubts and limitations. You've proven that his belief in you was justified." "I haven't proven anything yet," Sarah replied. "BUD/S is where the real test begins." "No, sweetheart. The real test was deciding to try in the first place. Everything else is just details." As Sarah prepared for sleep on her final night at Norfolk, she held her father's ring and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The laughter and skepticism she had faced at the recruitment center seemed like ancient history now, replaced by the respect of professional warriors and the opportunity to pursue her deepest ambitions. Tomorrow would begin the next phase of a journey that might ultimately lead her to wear the same SEAL trident that her father had earned through his own courage and sacrifice. The road ahead would be longer and more difficult than anything she had yet experienced, but for the first time in her life, Sarah felt completely confident in her ability to meet whatever challenges awaited. The transformation that had begun with mockery at a recruitment center had evolved through the crucible of military training into something approaching destiny. Sarah Mitchell was no longer just a young woman with a dream. She was a proven candidate for the most exclusive military unit in the world, carrying forward the legacy of a father who had shown her that true strength came from character rather than circumstances. The hardest part of the journey still lay ahead, but Sarah was ready. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beyond the beaches of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, its waves crashing against the shore with a rhythm that had witnessed the transformation of countless ordinary sailors into extraordinary warriors. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the famous Grinder, the concrete courtyard where basic underwater demolition/SEAL training had forged legends for over 7 decades. In her hands were orders that represented the culmination of everything she had worked towards since that first day at the recruitment center. BUD/S was unlike any military training program in the world. Where other courses might last weeks or months, BUD/S stretched across nearly 8 months of relentless physical and mental challenges designed to identify the rare individuals who possessed the character to serve among America's most elite warriors. The statistics were sobering. Of every 100 candidates who began the program, fewer than 25 would ultimately earn the right to wear the SEAL trident. Sarah reported to the BUD/S compound on a Monday morning in late spring, joining Class 347, a group of 42 candidates who had been drawn from across the Navy and other military branches. Her first impression of her new classmates was that they represented the pinnacle of military athleticism and preparation. These were not the typical recruits she had encountered earlier in her military career. Every person in the formation looked like they could have competed in professional athletics. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Valdez was the senior officer assigned to oversee Class 347, a position that carried enormous responsibility for identifying and developing the next generation of SEAL operators. Valdez herself was a groundbreaking figure in the special operations community, having been among the first women to complete the rigorous training required for special operations support roles. "Welcome to BUD/S," Valdez announced to the assembled candidates. "You are here because you have demonstrated exceptional potential during previous training. However, potential means nothing in this environment. Only performance matters, and performance will be measured by standards that have been refined over decades of combat operations." Sarah found herself standing next to Marcus Rodriguez, a former college football player whose physical presence was intimidating even by BUD/S standards. Rodriguez had been preparing for special operations training since high school, following a regimen designed by former SEALs who had served as mentors and coaches. On her other side was Jennifer Kim, a former Air Force pararescue specialist who had transferred to the Navy specifically to pursue SEAL training. Kim's background in combat search and rescue had provided her with experience in high-stress environments that few other candidates possessed. The diversity of backgrounds represented in Class 347 was remarkable, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she remained different from her peers in fundamental ways. Where others had linear career paths that had led them directly to BUD/S, her journey had been marked by setbacks, challenges, and the constant need to prove herself in environments that questioned her right to be there. The first phase of BUD/S training lasted 8 weeks and focused on building the foundational fitness and water skills required for all subsequent training. The physical demands were immediately apparent as candidates were subjected to training sessions that began before dawn and continued until well after dark. Sarah's slight limp, which had become barely noticeable during her previous training, became more pronounced as the intensity of workouts increased. The constant running on sand, the endless calisthenics sessions, and the demanding obstacle courses all stressed her left leg in ways that her rehabilitation had never fully addressed. During the first week's physical screening test, Sarah struggled with the push-up requirements, her smaller frame placing her at a disadvantage compared to candidates who had been building upper body strength for years. Her time on the 4-mile run was respectable but not outstanding, and her performance on the obstacle course revealed the limitations that her injury continued to impose. Instructor Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert Martinez had been training SEAL candidates for over 12 years, and his ability to identify both potential and weakness was legendary throughout the special operations community. Martinez approached training with a philosophy that emphasized mental toughness over pure physical ability, but he also understood that minimum standards existed for valid reasons. "Mitchell," Martinez called after observing Sarah's performance during a particularly challenging ocean swim. "How are you feeling about the physical demands so far?" Sarah treaded water alongside her instructor, her breathing controlled despite the obvious effort she had been expending. "I'm meeting the minimum standards, Senior Chief. I know I need to continue improving, but I'm confident I can handle whatever challenges come next." Martinez studied her for a moment, noting the determination in her eyes, but also the slight fatigue that suggested she was working harder than most candidates to achieve similar results. The minimum standards are just that, minimum. As training progresses, the demands will increase exponentially. Are you prepared for that reality? "Yes, Senior Chief. I didn't come here to do the minimum. I came here to become the best operator I can possibly be." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of distress from another candidate who was struggling during the swim. Without hesitation, Sarah moved toward the struggling swimmer, offering assistance and encouragement until instructors could provide more formal support. Martinez observed the interaction with interest, making mental notes about Sarah's instinctive response to a teammate's distress. In his experience, candidates who naturally prioritized others' welfare over their own performance often possessed the character traits that made exceptional operators. As the weeks progressed, Sarah's academic and technical backgrounds began to provide advantages that pure athleticism couldn't match. During classes on navigation, demolitions, and tactical planning, her engineering education allowed her to grasp complex concepts more quickly than many of her physically superior classmates. When Class 347 was assigned a mission planning exercise that required calculating explosive charges for a bridge demolition, Sarah's mathematical skills proved invaluable. While other candidates struggled with the technical calculations, she quickly determined the proper charge placement and timing sequences needed for mission success. More importantly, her natural teaching ability helped other candidates understand difficult concepts, creating a dynamic where the entire class performed better because of her contributions. Rodriguez, despite his impressive physical abilities, frequently sought Sarah's help with technical subjects that challenged his high school education. "I don't understand how you make this stuff look so easy," Rodriguez commented during a break in their demolitions training. "I've been studying this material for hours, and you explain it in 5 minutes better than the instructors did in 5 hours." Sarah smiled, remembering similar conversations from her college engineering courses. "It's not that it's easy. It's that I've learned different ways to approach technical problems. Once you understand the underlying principles, the specific applications become much more straightforward." The relationship she developed with her classmates became one of Sarah's greatest strengths during the early phases of training. While some candidates approached BUD/S as an individual challenge where they needed to outperform everyone else, Sarah understood that success depended on collective achievement. When Kim struggled during long-distance runs due to a minor ankle injury, Sarah adjusted her own pace to provide encouragement and support. When Rodriguez needed additional help with navigation techniques, Sarah spent her limited free time reviewing concepts and helping him develop better study strategies. Her approach didn't go unnoticed by the instructional staff, who were constantly evaluating candidates for the leadership qualities that would be essential during actual combat operations. Chief Petty Officer Amanda Foster, one of the few female instructors in the BUD/S program, had been watching Sarah's progress with particular interest. Foster's own career had been marked by breaking barriers and proving herself in male-dominated environments, and she recognized similar qualities in Sarah's approach to training. "Mitchell," Foster called after observing Sarah's performance during a team-based navigation exercise where her group had significantly outperformed all others. "Walk with me." They moved away from the other candidates, finding a quiet spot overlooking the Pacific where they could speak privately. "I've been watching your integration with the class, and I'm impressed with your leadership approach. You seem to understand that BUD/S isn't about individual achievement." Sarah nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading but sensing that Foster's feedback would be important. "At the same time," Foster continued, "I'm concerned about your physical performance. The standards aren't going to get easier, and I can see that you're working harder than most candidates to meet current requirements. How do you plan to address that challenge?" The question was direct but not unsympathetic, and Sarah appreciated Foster's honesty. "Chief, I know I'm not the strongest or fastest candidate in the class, but I also know that real missions require more than just physical ability. They require people who can think under pressure, who can adapt when plans fall apart, and who will never abandon their teammates." Foster smiled slightly. "That's a good answer, but it doesn't address the physical reality. What happens when your teammates need you to carry a wounded operator for miles through hostile territory? What happens when mission success depends on your ability to climb a wall that's just beyond your current physical limits?" The challenges Foster described were not theoretical. They reflected real situations that SEAL teams faced during actual combat operations, and Sarah understood that her response would demonstrate whether she truly grasped the demands of Special Operations Service. "Then, I'll find a way to meet those challenges, Chief. I'll train harder, I'll develop better techniques, and I'll push myself beyond what I thought possible. But, most importantly, I'll make sure that my teammates know they can count on me absolutely, regardless of the circumstances." Foster studied Sarah for a long moment, seeing in her expression the same determination that had carried other unlikely candidates through the crucible of BUD/S training. "I believe you will," Foster said finally. "But belief isn't enough. You need to demonstrate continuous improvement, both for yourself and for your classmates who are depending on you." The conversation with Foster marked a turning point in Sarah's approach to training. While she had always worked hard, she now understood that her current level of effort was insufficient for the challenges ahead. She began spending additional time in the gym, focusing specifically on building the upper body strength.